The House of Mystery presents Inside Writing, the radio show where authors discuss their writing process in all genres.
Welcome back into the House of Mystery, and of course I'm Al Warren, and co-host today, Mr. David North Martino.
Oh, it's my full name today.
Yeah, I'm being polite. I'm being polite.
What is this? Who has taken over Al?
No, I'm getting close to holidays, you see, and then you'll be doing. So I got to be nice to you before you do the work.
Okay.
Otherwise, you'll be nasty on air, saying bad things about me when I'm gone. You know.
Would I ever do that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
maybe.
Yeah, I can see it. I can see it just be a whole big, huge gab session about me. You know, I could see it. Whole team. There'll be shows dedicated to me, and you'll be writing it down on a whiteboard, and everybody will be going over all the details.
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
I'm writing it down.
Yeah. Anyway. Well, now, speaking of details in murder, we're going to talk about the book, The Science of Murder, and its forensics of Agatha Christie. Now, all the way from the UK, we have Carla Valentine. So thank you for coming on the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Well, this is wonderful, but I before we get into this fascinating book, I want to talk about, because you have this is the first time I've ever interviewed a fiction writer or a writer that sort of has your background or kind of what you do for a living. So let's talk about you a little bit first so the listeners know kind of who you are. So who is Carla Valentine?
Well, the easiest way to describe it is to say that I'm a mortician. But I think over in the UK, I worked for a decade on autopsies with, forensic pathologists, removing the organs from the deceased, taking samples, replacing them, making them ready for viewing for the families. And then I've kind of moved on to conserving old Victorian human tissue specimens in an old museum. So basically I kind of work with the dead, and I've got 1 foot in the past and I've got 1 foot in the present of the dead. And that's what my interests are really in my whole career.
It's interesting. How did you get into that kind of a business?
It sounds odd to say that I did want to do it ever since I was really young. And I loved biology when I was at school, when I was about sort of 7 or 8. And I was reading Agatha Christie, and I was kind of getting this idea about forensic science and forensic pathology without it really being explicitly described as that subject, if you see what I mean. So I just became really fascinated with the human body, how it's sort of like a canvas that will show you information, about the kind of diseases that you've had through your life and the way that you died, and then how you can connect that to crimes in the whole sort of forensic sphere. So I really was interested in it from a really young age, about 8 or 9. And I went to university, studied forensic science. I worked for an embalmer for a year to get some work experience, and finally got a job as an anatomical pathology technician, which is what I then did for the next 10 years.
Wow.
A lot of bodies.
And so, what kind of food do you like when you work as an embalmer? What do you? Well, it's just what I ask is because we see a lot of shows, and they have 1 or 2 different types of embalmer, but quite often they're very callous, or they're very very into it and stuff. So were you able to eat during the middle of filling fluid?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, when you work with the dead, particularly when I was a pathology technician, it's actually incredibly physical work anyway, because you're sort of doing a lot of physical manoeuvring and manual sort of handling, and you just get really, really hungry because you're tired. I think a lot of people became vegetarians and things like that, but I'm not. I really enjoy a steak or some ribs or whatever. So it didn't put me off. No.
Medium rare ribs with gravy. Yeah. Steak. Yeah, it's a whole new meaning to steak and kidney pie.
Exactly. Yeah. And things being blue. I don't know if you have that phrase over there, but we want something really
blue rare. Yeah.
So yeah, no, I'm not vegan or anything like that. I enjoy good meat though. I don't like sort of factory meat type thing. Nice organic steak for me, I think.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you do it or don't, right? Do it right or don't.
Exactly.
I always say that too, right? Either it's, the fake stuff never works.
Yeah, exactly. If you're going to do it right or don't do it at all.
Yeah, it's like sugar and butter and all that. Either do it or don't.
Yeah.
Don't try to do all that other stuff, just don't then, But,
I can tell you what that will do to your insides anyway, things like margarine. You'd be better off eating butter once a month than eating margarine every day, so.
Yeah, I guess that's true. That would probably change your own eating habits and what you, because you would know better.
Yeah, sure, it definitely can do. I mean, I'm not a smoker. I'm very sort of against smoking because I've seen the damage that it can do to lungs. You can see the cirrhosis of the liver, and it does make you very aware that we are these really intricate, fragile pieces of, of meat really, and intricate machines. And if we don't treat them right, then if they can go wrong in a lot of different ways. So it does give you a lot of respect, I think, for the human body.
Yeah, I've always thought of Dave as a real piece of meat. But that's a whole other show here. We've got, but so this is really, really cool. So how did you decide to get into writing something like The Science of Murder? Like the forensics of Agatha Christie. So what was kind of what was on your mind when you started putting this together?
Well, I'd already written one book about my sort of life working in mortuaries, and that's out in the US as The Chick and the Dead. And I was actually due to write my second book, focusing more on bones and ossuary displays. And then actually I got pregnant and COVID happened. So the plan had been to go around Europe and write about, all these different ossuaries. And obviously I couldn't do that with being pregnant and then COVID. So I was sat there just watching an Agatha Christie adaptation, the David Suchet ones, that are just really, really lovely to watch. And he started to talk about rifling in a gun. And I thought, well, that's an interesting forensic reference for Agatha to have used if it was, really in the book. So I went and dug the book out and looked for the reference, and it was in the book. And that was just what gave me the idea, really, because I thought, I'm sure nobody's really done that before. Nobody's looked at the forensics of Agatha Christie. So once I started to research that, I realised that, nobody had done it. So it was great.
Do you find that in general, fictional crime writers and murder noir type books and authors are not as accurate as they should be, maybe, in dealing with this?
I think there's two different camps, really, when you think about this. I mean, I literally just did a panel discussion about this at Harrogate Crime Festival, but there are some people who write fiction that are in the fields themselves, so they're obviously very, very aware of how it is in real life. So I'm thinking of people here like Kathy Rikes, who's obviously a forensic anthropologist as well as a writer, Patricia Cornwell, who worked in the medical examiner's office. So I think we get asked a lot of questions by writers, as mortuary technicians, we get a lot of emails to say, am I getting this correct? And also consult on films and things like that. So I think there are a lot of people out there that really want to get that accuracy. And then there are others that, perhaps the accuracy isn't really as necessary. Maybe it's a bit more dramatic than it is realistic.
Well, in the same vein, you talk about rifling and stuff. Do you know how Agatha Christie went about her own research? Because I know she had to have knowledge of, fingerprints, firearms, handwriting, blood splatter, all that stuff.
Yeah, so basically, when she first wrote her first book, The Mysterious Affair at Styles, there was a poisoning death in this book, and that was because she was actually working in the dispensary of a hospital during the war. So she already had this really great encyclopedic knowledge of poisons, different chemicals like that. Then obviously became famous as Agatha Christie, and wrote a few more books. And she doesn't talk in her autobiography about how she researched, but she does talk about the fact that she would read criminalistic journals. She was also part of what they called the Detection Club. So all of the sort of lot of detective fiction writers of the day, like Dorothy L. Sayers, G.K. Chesterton, they were all part of a group who they would have speakers come and talk to them, people who are pathologists or lawyers, and talk to them about criminalistics and criminal cases. So I think she, picked up a few books as well. A lot of forensics, famous forensic scientists like Edmund Locard had written books around the time that she was kind of writing hers. So I think she did a variety of different things. So she doesn't talk about it specifically, but she kind of gives you an indication of what she did.
At the end of the day, what are you going to tell us about Agatha Christie?
Oh, well, it's definitely, she's not a sort of cozy crime writer at all. She's definitely got this, sort of aura of just hanging around in vicarages and having crumpets and things like that. And people are really surprised when they see that half of her books are set in the Middle East, because she lived there for half of the year with her archaeologist husband. So it's definitely the idea of cozy crime. It's not all about cozy crime, and it's not all about sort of things like arsenic, which don't leave a mark or don't leave any signs of violence. There's some quite gory stories that she's written. She references decomposing bodies. She talks about blunt force trauma, and some of the books are really quite surprisingly dark. I'm thinking in particular of Endless Night, which is one that she wrote towards the end of her life, and it's just unbelievable. So I think the idea that she's this cozy old woman, we'll throw that out and we'll start to talk about blood spatter and autopsies and all that sort of thing.
So she's a savage.
Yeah. A savage is one could also be at the same time as being a lady in the sort of 1930s and 1940s.
Well, yeah, she could still be a lady and have bodies in the basement. Right?
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, So what do you get out of this for yourself? Like, what happens to you when you go through someone like Agatha Christie and you're doing this book? At the end of it, do you find that you kind of, I don't know, do you change in the way that you handle forensics and maybe what you think of writers sometimes?
Well, I with working in the museum and obviously trying to communicate about medical specimens to modern pathology and medical students, it's really interesting to have this sort of link with Agatha Christie and true crimes, because some of the specimens that we have in our collection have been prepared by pathologists that were working on the most famous crimes that Agatha is talking about. So things like the Dr. Crippen case, the Brides in the Bath, the Crumbles murders, these are all Bernard Spilsbury cases. And Bernard Spilsbury is a really famous pathologist in the UK. And it sort of gives me this kind of link between real life crime, solvers and what the importance of these historical specimens are, because I didn't know that Agatha used them in that sense in her books until I started to research it. So it's just interesting knowledge that I want to impart to other people as well, particularly if they're into crime fiction, because it was accurate for its day, and it's really quite astounding that she got so many things right.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. I think that's what makes a good writer, because the worst thing in the world is reading a book or watching a program that's supposed to be taking place in a certain date and time, and they get things wrong.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think there's two really interesting things about Agatha Christie, and the first, I think, is that she actually coined the phrase "the scene of the crime." So obviously we use that right across the board within forensics, but the first known sort of recording of that phrase is in her book, The Murder on the Links, from 1923. So you can see there she's already kind of contributed to the, forensic sciences landscape. And similarly, in the first book, The Mysterious Affair at Styles, she equipped Hercule Poirot with something that was akin to a crime scene examiner's kit, but the crime scene examiner's kit didn't exist at that point. So she actually kind of thought of that herself, and it was only in 1924 that Bernard Spilsbury kind of came up with the idea of having a crime scene examiner's kit, because the police were just picking up chunks of human flesh, with their fingers. They were, mopping up blood with their own handkerchiefs. So she sort of she had the idea for that before it actually was a thing in real life.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing that they would just use their hands and fingers and all the all the crime scenes and the parts. It just never crossed their mind, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, before people knew about the potential for DNA to be, contaminants and hairs and things like that, people didn't realize they had to be so careful. And now the more analytical we've got and the harder we can, the deeper we can look, the more careful we have to be, because, we can pick up DNA on crime scenes from microscopic globules of saliva, you know, from somebody talking. So it's just interesting that you can see that sort of arc of development of the science with the true crimes through her books as well.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to ask that, the state of forensics for Agatha Christie during her lifetime. But now that you've gone over that, it makes me wonder, did she contribute to this increase, this arc of, better forensics through her work?
I think she probably did, I would say, in a slightly more tangential way, possibly, because I'm sure you guys are aware of Frances Glessner Lee, who was an American lady who really contributed to forensic science over in the US. And I think I know that they've talked about crime scene miniatures, which is what Frances Glessner Lee, created. And I know that Christie talked about miniatures and maps and things like that in her books. So there's definitely some crossover there. And as I say, it's more about contributing to just this idea of, I don't know, it's difficult to say that she did contribute, but sort of in a more tangential way, if you see what I mean.
Maybe she inspired.
Yes, yeah.
Some
and I know
forensics, some future forensics.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm hoping that, like with my book, it will then she'll then continue to inspire, the new generation of forensic pathologists or forensic scientists. So we shall see.
Mm. Yeah, I don't think the human race has a chance, but after
positive, Al.
After COVID, that was enough, right? After the way people handled COVID,
I know.
It's got to be crazy for someone that's in the science business to all of a sudden see kind of the outlandish sort of claims that you hear during something like that. You must have just been going,
it's the same as we sort of hear with when we have the anti-vaccination people as well, or these sort of crazy claims. And it's been a very interesting time for all of us, I think. But I think one of the important things to remember with COVID and wearing these masks is I just found it interesting how few illnesses I've had in general, because we're using public transport and things in big cities. You don't just pick up things like COVID, you pick up colds and flus and norovirus. So it was quite an interesting experience to not get any sniffles or anything for a long time.
Yeah, I thought it was amazing. I had nothing for 2 years, nothing. I just want to wear my mask all the time now.
Yeah, that's it.
But but that's a different story.
Yes.
I carry a whip too. Now, Spilsbury, when you talk about him, was he a good pathologist or not?
Bernard Spilsbury was a let's say very well known.
Oh, I caught on to a series, Murder Mystery in My Family.
Oh yes, yes, I know.
And I watched the 3-4 seasons of it. I really got hooked.
Yeah.
And I just thought it was great. I knew they were never going to really achieve anything, but it was a really interesting show, and I really loved the characters. And Spilsbury was brought up a lot.
Yeah.
And it seemed like not in a good way. In a lot of his determinations were kind of very questionable. And I just wonder. And I know he's well known, and he's kind of considered something real famous for that category. But what's your opinion because you're in that kind of field? Yeah,
for sure. I mean, and I've read a lot about Spilsbury, and we hold some of his specimens, as I say, and some note cards and things in our collection. And the thing about Spilsbury was that he was he sort of got, he came into prominence with the famous case, Dr. Crippen, and he was such a personality, and he was so, very knowledgeable, it seemed, that people didn't really question him. And I think that that caused a problem later on. So for a long time, he was known as this eminent pathologist who was, brilliant. He worked alone, long hours, and, just knew everything about pathology and was really dedicated. But I think there became a point where he wasn't having his work peer reviewed, he wasn't training anybody, and he was he thought he was so right all the time that he wasn't really willing to bend. And I think one of the most interesting things that we've discovered really since, well, and especially since I started to write this book, was about the fact that, Bernard Spilsbury is the one that said that Cora Crippen had been in, Dr. Crippen's basement, and she was buried in there. And he said, there's a scar here on the tissue. I know that this is a type of, cesarean scar. I know that Cora had it, so this is therefore her body. And years later, in sort of 2012, we had those specimens sampled for DNA. And not only are they not Cora Crippen's, but they're not even female. Mm. So, so this is the kind of thing where you go, well, what on earth has happened there? And he committed suicide, I don't know if you know, in 1947. He gassed himself with by the Bunsen burners in the lab. So he was just very, very magnetic personality, very interesting, but obviously not necessarily always right. And I think that caused a problem. But he did, start some, really amazing things. As I say, it's him who came up with the idea of a crime scene examiner's kit. So he contributed a lot as well.
I was going to say he gassed himself. Maybe he worked with Dave for a while.
Hi, Dave. You like this every week?
Yeah, just about. Yeah, that's what I'm known for. But at the end of the day, so someone runs out and picks up this book, which they should, just for the sheer fun of it. But what is it? Do you want people to get something out of the book other than entertainment or a little bit of value? Is there sort of a purpose to this?
I think one of the main purposes is to stop the word forensic being used in the wrong context, because that's kind of irritating when you work in this world, because a lot of people will say, forensic dissection of football match last night, that kind of thing. Yeah. And I get an awful lot of Google alerts to tell me really random stories about football matches. But yeah, so I think that what I'd like people to get from it is the fact that, we thought we knew everything about Agatha Christie, but there was still this sort of little extra part of her personality where she was very dedicated to being realistic when it came to crimes and crime scenes, but also to show the hard work that people put in at the beginning of that century in science and in forensic science itself. It really flourished. Is this idea of how hard people were working at the beginning of that century to kind of make forensic science flourish. There were other scientists in the US and in the UK, not just Bernard Spilsbury, doing comparisons of hair, human hair to animal hair, looking at fingernails, all these kinds of things that then became our basic pathology kit that we use to sort of, diagnose disease and help solve murders. So, I'd like people to sort of see that story and see how hard people worked in these amazing cases that came into the news, that would showcase a new technique on blood spatter or blood group or anything like that, really.
So it's come a long way.
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you think about it, we've only been using DNA comparisons since 1986. And that just seems so recent to me now, having been talking about, forensics from 1900 onwards, really. Because Edmond Locard, who is he's the French criminologist that coined the phrase, every contact leaves a trace, which is basically the sort of forensic science, basic tenets. He was, around 1900, 1910 is when he was writing. 1910 was the Dr. Crippen case. So all of the 1920s, 1930s and 40s, like really just amazing advances in how you look at the rifling inside of, guns to compare ballistics, and going from blood groups where you just say somebody was A or B, whatever, and then being able to kind of define them slightly more. All of that work that was happening at the same point at the beginning of that century, I think, is really important.
It was a lot tougher too back then, wasn't it, to try and get the direction to go in, I would imagine, of what to look for in forensics.
Yeah, and I think from what I've sort of learned from researching all these different contributors to the science is that a lot of them, they did it because it was a passion of theirs, and so they would be doing it, maybe even outside of their normal work hours. Some people, had full-time jobs as chemical analysis, scientists for, say, a gasoline company, but then they would do other things in the evening on their own time because they believed it was going to be useful for forensics. People who examine things like paints, different types of chromatography to separate out different chemicals. A lot of people just did it on their own dime or on their own time because they felt so passionate about it, and that's kind of all contributed to what we now use. And hopefully it's helping to catch criminals, it's helping to solve cases, people who've who've lost family and friends, you know, and they need some closure. And they get that because of these dedicated scientists.
Do you plan on doing more books kind of like this with other authors?
I don't know, actually, because I'd like to revisit the idea of my bone book now that we can sort of travel around a little bit more. I'd quite like to start, you know, really get into bones as well, because I've done a lot of soft tissues with my Chick in the Dead book, or Past Mortems it was called in the UK. But I've also got more ideas about Agatha Christie as well, because I did forensic archaeology and anthropology at military school, and she married an archaeologist, spent a lot of time out at archaeological digs, and I'd really like to look into that aspect of her life more, actually, as well, and how she contributed to archaeology. In the British Museum, we've got some items from the digs that she was on with her husband, and she cleaned them with her own face cream and things like that, because they didn't really have any guidelines. So she was sort of like a pioneer in archaeology as well as forensics. So so who knows? There's a lot of different avenues I might, you know, try and go down.
Do you have a favorite Agatha Christie novel?
I get asked this so many times, and it's so difficult to say. I always tend to do. I'm going to be at the Agatha Christie Festival in Torquay in September, and I'm going to be part of an event, and we're talking about our 3 favourites. I tend to choose 3 books because I'll usually choose 1 Marple and 1 Poirot and maybe 1 standalone. So I'm going to go with Endless Night as my favourite standalone. I think my favourite Marple is The Moving Finger, or A Murder is Announced. It's difficult to choose. Poirot, I love Appointment with Death, and I love The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. So it's really difficult. There's so many books, you know, it's too hard to choose.
What would you tell her? That's the best way. What would you tell her if she was alive today, or if you were alive back then and you had a chance to meet her? Oh. Would there be anything that you would say to her, or ask her, or tell her to do different, or what would you want to say to her?
Oh, I would definitely say thank you for being an inspiration to me, and, you know, like millions of people. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of other people that read her books and have ended up in this sort of field, the forensics field, in one way or another. But for me in particular, I'd never really thought about how much of an influence she had on me. When I talk about getting into the field in my first book, Past Mortems, it was actually because I saw my granddad die. So I was about 7 or 8, and he had a stroke. And at the time I was reading Agatha Christie books, and as I said, I loved biology at school. And then my granddad died, and it was just one of those turning point moments for me, where I was kind of, you know, shocked and scared, obviously, because I was only a kid, but kind of wanted to know more about the process so I could be a bit more, you know, better armed, I guess, with the knowledge. And I was fascinated from that point with pathology. So it's not until I started to write this book that I realised a lot of that came from reading Agatha Christie's, because I just loved to read when I was younger, and I'd already read, you know, all the kids' books by the time I was about 6. You know, I'd gone through all the Enid Blytons and the Beatrix Potters, and I was on to Agatha Christie at the age of sort of 8 and 9. So I would have to say to her, thank you so much for being an inspiration, because my entire sort of career and all my hobbies are kind of dedicated to this field, and, you know, and that was partly her.
So I have to ask, so do you ever have any ghostly experiences with bodies? I
haven't, you know, and I wouldn't say that, you know, I definitely believe in ghosts, or that I definitely don't. I mean, I absolutely, you know, think there could be anything out there. But I do wonder why I've not really had any experiences. You know, I haven't been around so many dead bodies. But then a friend of mine she was an APT like me, she used to go and see a medium. And the medium said, oh, they don't really like to hang around the mortuary. They don't really want to see that. They prefer to go to the funeral home and check that the funeral arrangements are being made by the family, like, okay. So whether she was right about that, I don't know. But in my experience, no, I haven't had anything very particularly interesting happen.
Oh, yeah, I see, because I was just wondering, you know, maybe some doors open or lights go on and off, and I would think going around with being so many bodies, and, you know, it would sort of be...
Yeah, you'd think it'd come with the territory. Like, there's a couple of films, like The Possession of Hannah Grace is one, and there's, I don't know if you've seen The Autopsy of Jane Doe, but I actually was the consultant on that by the director of Troll Hunter, and it is about a sort of haunted, you know, body in a mortuary. And I was like, yeah, you know, I was expecting that kind of thing. I figured it would go with the territory, but no, it's all been very peaceful. It's live people I have more trouble with, always live people.
Well, yeah, it's always it's a lot more work, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's true. I don't enjoy two-sided conversations. I'm so used to one-sided ones.
Yeah, I guess they never talk back, do they?
Yeah, I don't need your opinion because I'm used to not getting anyone's opinion.
Oh, do you ever talk to them then? Is that sort of?
Yeah, well, I think we do that, and especially when we're working on autopsies and things, because it's a sort of it's a respect thing, you know, to kind of call them by their name. You know, Alan, I'd say, how are you today, Alan? You know, make sure that you're all tidy and dignified. So yeah, I think that's just part of the territory, really, because it's just like talking to patients if you're a doctor, I guess.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. What a life. Anyway, so now, do you have a website set up, and do you have social media? Do you like to interact with fans and people that are interested in this?
Yeah, I do indeed. So my Instagram is past_mortems, and that is where I share a lot of human remains images from my collection, from different research that I do, and different exhibitions I go to, different artists I follow. So that's past mortems, and my website is www.carlavalentine.co.uk. And all my socials are on there and everything anyway, because I'm on Twitter and, you know, all that sort of thing too.
Yeah. Did you ever get kind of weird questions? I guess you would.
Yeah. Yeah, I do get weird questions. I'm trying to think of some good ones that I've had. Sometimes I just get questions like, oh, you know, can you tell me how to pickle my kitten? Or, you know, something like, I don't know, you get a lot of strange questions, yeah. It's things like debunking myths, like this idea that the nails and the hair grow after death, and obviously they don't, and actually it's just because the flesh and the skin dehydrates when you die, and it pulls back a little bit, and it can make stubble look more prominent. It can make fingernails look a little bit longer. So I do a lot of debunking myths like that. Is it true that the dead sit up and burp? You know, all that kind of nonsense. Not in my experience.
which created the fingers and nails, the vampire and werewolf.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Stuff,
yeah. Conditions like catalepsy, which people seemed like they were dead, and then they get buried alive, and then later on, and I think it's Caleb Wilde is one of my he's a US undertaker. He's a sort of a friend of mine, and we share books, you know, each other's books and everything. And he's the one who said that he always likes to tie the shoelaces of the dead together in case there's a zombie apocalypse, which I thought was very funny. And he just
all trip and fall.
Yeah, exactly. Can you imagine it? They get out of the fridge, and you think, oh my god, they're going to get me, and then they're like dominoes. So yeah, that it's mortician humour for you.
That's right. Well, how was it working on a production? You had mentioned that you were working on a production. How did that work for you?
It was interesting because they obviously pay you to do a job, and you know they want your input, but sometimes it can be a case of, if we want this scene to look as dramatic as we like it to be, we're going to have to kind of ignore the realism aspect of it and go with the drama. So we do a lot of consulting, and a lot of also then getting told, okay, well, we totally understand that, but we're not going to go with that. And you can see why, because there is, you sort of need drama and things like that in films. But one thing that I was quite adamant about when we did the autopsy of Jane Doe is that they tried to depict the head, sort of the scalpels, the scalp being reflected for, the examination of the head and the brain. We don't do it across the forehead, obviously, like Frankenstein's monster, but they tried to do it like that in the film, and I really didn't want them to do that, because a lot of us APTs, mortuary workers, we spend a lot of our time trying to make family members aware that we don't, disfigure their deceased relatives. So we don't want it to be put into a film. And so sometimes I sort of have to put my foot down a little bit and say, no, don't depict it like that, or do depict it like this. But it's interesting. It's always a lot more boring than you think, working on films and TV. It's lots of very boring long hours in the cold.
Oh yeah, I'd imagine, So what's your favorite type of shows to watch? Like Most Haunted or something? Or
well, I used to, I'll tell you what I do love. I've already spoken about Murder, She Wrote to David already before we even got started. I actually really love things like Murder, She Wrote, because that doesn't have to be really very realistic, and it's so completely unbelievable, but it's such a joy to be, you know, immersed in that world, because it's you know, it's not triggering or anything, it's just so twee. So I love things like Murder, She Wrote, and I love Midsummer Murders over in the UK. But I watch a lot of things like Stranger Things, you know, Lucifer, things like that. A lot of and The Haunting of Hill House. You know, things that are a bit of escapism and a bit of horror, a bit of light haunting, and that's me for the evening.
Wow. Wow. I mean, yeah. You probably drink tea a lot, right?
Yeah, I drink gin a lot though as well.
There you go.
Yeah, you know, yeah, no, I do. My husband did get me my own sort of like individual teapot, and I do sometimes, you know, I'm taking a lunch break and I think I'm going to put an episode of Murder, She Wrote on, I'm going to have a cup of tea and some biscuits with my individual teapot. So there is definitely a sort of twee English aspect of, you know, of that kind of thing. But I think, yeah, it's like the Suchet adaptations, as sort of mentioned, the styling on them is so stunning that it's a completely different world, you know, and it's like a break for your brain. So I find those to be a bit more of a nice escape, whereas I don't really watch things like Silent Witness, because they're too close to reality and then they don't get it right, and it can just be really annoying.
Why do you think that is? You know, I always want to ask that question, because quite often whenever we talk to someone in the sciences and different fields like yourself, and I always hear this because they get it wrong, or of course that's not real and stuff. I understand trying to, some of the shows, they only have an hour and they've got to get it all resolved. But why do they do things like that are so wrong at times?
I think, honestly, I think a lot of it is to do with either the visuals or the sort of the enacted drama, because the things that I think of that comes to me, there's a particular image of, I think an autopsy was being performed on CSI, and the room was practically black, you know, it was dark because obviously it looked really atmospheric, and I was like, the pathologist is examining this body for, you know, microfibers and all sorts. Like we literally have lights, like surgical lights blazing down on these bodies. We don't do it in the gloom. And one of my favorite, I ran a blog for a long time, and one of my favorite scenes is in a horror film called Valentine. I don't know whether you guys have seen it. David Boreanaz is in it, and there's a girl, medical student, and she goes in to do some corpse chopping in the middle of the night, you know, and she's on her own, she's got no PPE on, she's got her breast kind of, you know, popping out of her vest, and the guy comes and he kills her, you know, and all this stuff. And I'm like, in the UK, the reality of that corpse dissection, you know, from a donor individual, there was like eight people to one cadaver, because we don't have enough cadavers, you know, or enough space for the cadavers. You don't go in after hours in the dark and, you know, wave a scalpel around with your breasts out. So it's obviously a lot of it is just for entertainment value, you know, the way that it looks on screen. It obviously looks a lot more sexy when it's gloomy and, you know, sweaty breasted.
Yeah, well, you don't wear tight little one-piece outfits and go in there. And,
it's shocking, isn't it? No, just scrubs. I get them as tight as I can.
Big heels, like 8-inch heels, and walking around the.
And they did make a change. I don't know whether you noticed, but the very early series of CSI, you know, they used to kind of go to these crime scenes in Las Vegas, and the women's hair would be blowing around, and they'd be in heels and everything. But as they got a little bit more sort of like, you know, as they went through the decades, they did start to think, maybe we should make our forensic experts look like experts, you know, put them in suits and things. And then they go crazy, and they do, like, I don't know whether you watch Bones, but they have like this hologram machine that can, you know, recreate the skeleton out of a hologram, spin around in the air. So, you know, you can't really win, can you? You're always going to have some crazy scene for entertainment value, I think.
Well, what about it? One of the things that it has been in crime shows and books, like right through history and still to this day, is they're always establishing time of death, and they can say, "Oh, he died 2 hours ago," or something, right?
Yeah.
But that's not really true, is it?
No, it's not. It's funny because I write about time of death a lot in the autopsy chapter of this book, because a lot of the criticisms from, you know, about Agatha Christie and other, you know, detection story writers is that they do this scene of they do a time of death estimate that's too narrow. So basically, as you just said, you know, sort of between 2 and 4 p.m. And it's nonsense. Even using, we have this really complicated sort of bit of arithmetic called Hensch's nomogram, which is to help you work out time of death, and it's only accurate to maybe 5 hours plus, 5 hours minus a time. So you can't get accuracy, within like 2 hours. A friend of mine, a pathologist, said, I'll be able to tell what time he died if he gets shot through the watch. So that, one of the really interesting things about Agatha Christie is that her book, The Body in the Library, which I've completely forgotten about, is also one of my favourites. The Body in the Library, the alibi from the killers, it revolves around this very tight sort of time of death window. And realistically, that couldn't occur because obviously we don't have windows that small. But she's actually been talking about the time of death window from her very first book, and she recognises and mentions that you can only really be accurate to within about 4 or 5 hours each side. So when she then uses a tight time of death estimate in The Body in the Library, I know that she's doing it from a point of view of an awareness, if you see what I mean. She knows it's not real, but she still has to use that to keep this particular story going. Whereas in other books, she'll make it very clear we can't estimate time of death, that narrowly, really. So she does both, which I think is good.
Yeah. It's just strange that they keep using that same thing over and over again. But
for a while, it was gastric contents for sort of late, sort of late Victorian, and then sort of like to 20s, maybe 30s, maybe even a bit later. This idea that your gastric contents, that the state of digestion could tell how long you'd been, dead for, but it just doesn't work because of the massive amounts of adrenaline and things like that kick in when you're, dying. It's just too difficult to use it, so we don't really use that anymore. But Agatha Christie did talk about that, and it was used at the time, so she was quite correct in referencing it at the time. It's just fallen, from favour since. Very similar to the sort of the Bertillon system we used to use before fingerprints, when we used to use Alphonse Bertillon's measurements of the face and how wide the eyes are and the mug shots and all of that. And then once we discovered fingerprints were unique, there was no need to use all of that stuff anymore, But it's interesting to just watch that progress. Yeah.
And now DNA, and who knows how far that's going to go.
Well, there's DNA phenotyping now. I don't know whether you've seen this. So they can enter DNA into a sort of computer system, and it will read the DNA and basically build up a picture of what they think the person will look like-ish. Eye colour, build, hair colour, that sort of thing. So it's quite scary. They're getting very sort of minority report out there.
Yeah. It is kind of, it's something as you get older becomes scarier. But when you're young, it doesn't seem to matter.
Yeah.
It's one of those. Well, this has been fun. I've really enjoyed having you on the show. So now the book we're talking about is The Science of Murders, The Forensic of Agatha Christie, and that's Carla Valentine. Now, is this book available everywhere now?
It is, yes. It was Barnes & Noble monthly pick in June this year, which was wonderful. So it's all over the US. It's out in the UK under a slightly different name and a slightly different cover, which happens a lot. But it's always The Forensics of Agatha Christie, so people will be able to find it.
Well, fantastic. Well, we're going to have your site as well as the book, everything up on our site so people can find it if they have problems. So,
thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
Tired of wasting time trying to decide what to watch on your streaming service? Go to our website and look for the Martino movie reviews. You've been listening to the House of Mystery radio show. To find out more about our guests, hosts, or shows, go to www.houseofmystery.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.